Start since it's noon. So have a seat if you could. Have a seat at the table even. Seats are better. So we have Nick Parker today. Nick's a visiting scholar here for most of the month of November. Many of you met him and he was introduced last week. So I'll just let him go and we'll carry on as usual.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thanks for hosting me. I haven't been here very long, but I've already witnessed snow, thunderstorm, and tornado. So a lot has happened in the 5 or 6 days since I've arrived.
So that was just in the building.
So this is a draft paper of a project with Brian Leonard, a new assistant professor at Arizona State, and with Terry Anderson, who's almost retired now. He's emeritus from Montana State and now at the Hoover Institute. So the question that we're asking is related to this broader question of what explains poverty on Native American reservations. And so one prominent explanation is that this is due largely because of a history of repeated and systematic resource expropriation by the U.S. government on behalf of its constituents. And because of that history, Native Americans today have poor land, few resources from which to generate income. So it's not a mystery that reservations are poor because of this part of history. So we examined this and find that explanation to be incomplete. And one of our starting points is to try to come up with some measures of resource endowments, and the ones we focus on are measures of agricultural land quality. And so we try to measure the proportion of a reservation that has prime agricultural land, as would be exogenously defined based on rainfall, soil characteristics that wouldn't be affected so much by land management. And we find this relationship, which is across the landscape in the U.S. West, as you increase along the quality of land dimension, at first per capita income over a long period of time, 1970 to 2010, declines with increases in land quality before it increases. This relationship is not present if we use the same measure and apply it to U.S. counties that don't have reservations in it. There we see the intuitive relationship that higher land quality is monotonically associated with higher incomes. So that's kind of the motivating puzzle that casts that narrative as being at least incomplete. And so then the rest of the paper is about our explanation for this finding. And in sum, we point out that agricultural land quality in the late 19th century determined a reservation's experience with a major privatization effort through the Allotment Act, or the Dawes Act, executed from 1887 to 1934. As a result, when the process ended in 1934, reservations were left with a mix of land tenure. Some were not allotted, some were partially allotted, some were fully privatized, and that experience with allotment affects modern income differences today. So that's a summary of our story. Just one empirical result that kind of highlights this: if you look across reservations, which we do primarily in the paper, but we also look at parcels within reservations where we can find the data. So for about 15 Native American reservations, we were able to obtain land tenure data at the parcel level. And so this just plots regression results from about 100,000 parcel observations. And all we're doing is looking at how modern tenure relates within reservations to variation in soil quality. And the probability that this parcels ended up as allotted, but still in trust and not fully privatized, peaks kind of at the middle quality of the soil index. So stuff past the hump are parcels that were likely to be privatized in full, converted into fee simple parcels. Parcels to the left of the hump are parcels that weren't, in these cases, weren't ultimately claimed by individuals and reverted to tribal ownership. But you see patterns like this across reservations and within reservations. And the point being that this mid-land quality is associated with a particular kind of tenure, and that's this tenure we call allotted trust. The land isn't fully transferable. It's held in trust by the federal government, so there's bureaucratic oversight over land use. Importantly, the land has become fractionated over time because ownership is inherited by all the heirs of the original allottee. So if we want to get into this, I can show you figures that illustrate how bad that fractionation problem has been. But in some cases, you have 100, 150 owners of one 160 acre or 80 acre parcel. But all of these issues raise the transaction costs of resource use relative to full private ownership, but also potentially relative to tribal government ownership. It'd be communal or an informal system where the tribe divvies up ownership rights. So I'll just wrap up. I'll tell you, remind you what the statistical results are, and then I have a slide about discussion points that we may want to talk about. So some points are obvious. I just said the downward sloping part of that U we think is explained by a particular kind of land tenure that is inconducive for economic activity. We say that any assessment of the impacts of land tenure on economic outcomes has to control for land quality because there's such a selection process into these different types of tenure. I have a nice, I want to show you this real quick because this makes, I mean, this is kind of a case in point. This is a Google Earth image of the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation in North Dakota. And you look at this image and it turns out that most of the land over here was fully privatized, still within the reservation border, but it's fully private, fee simple land. Most of the land over here was not. And so you can look at this picture and you can say, well, private ownership encourages farming, at least, productive land use, but that inference is confounded potentially by the selection process. This might just be inherently better land than this. So that's one point. Oh, sorry. My system broke down. So we estimate the legacy of allotment. We say, you know, the legacy of it depends on what kind of resource endowment you had at the beginning of the privatization period. If you were allotted and fully privatized, we estimate roughly that is associated with an increase in modern per capita incomes of Native Americans, but a decrease relative to 1890 in the number of Native Americans that are living on the reservation. So people that are there are making more income than the model otherwise predicts, but there's fewer Native Americans there. The mean reservation saw no statistically significant effect on income per capita, but a decrease in populations. If you ended up in this status where most of your land was an allotted trust and fractionated, then you had both a decrease in income and a big decrease in Native American populations. So this is sort of, you know, the worst of all worlds. If allotment's trying to protect and keep and conserve culture and keep Native Americans on reservations, this is the worst outcome because it didn't do that and it's associated with lower incomes. So my final discussion points, we talk about anything other than this, I'm sure we will, but here were some points I thought I would end with. Constraints on property rights in a top-down privatization process are common. You see it with water, you see it with fish, lots of examples. And at best, these kind of constraints, like trusteeship in our case, constraints on transferability, at best they can balance multiple goals and guard against unwanted outcomes while still conveying some benefits of privatization. At worst, can expose resource users to the disruptions of privatization and oversight without granting benefits. And this is really a case in point of, I think, what can happen in a type of worst case scenario. And then a point I think is important here, and I'm sure you can help me make it better, but that formal property rights may be worse than just letting an informal system of property rights evolve, especially if the formal rights are designed for a particular goal to encourage agricultural productivity. Reservations have all their assets, and that system of property rights, even if it worked for agriculture, might not work for the other endowments that they have. So thanks for your patience. Went over 5 minutes a little bit, but I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, I'll take the cue. I'll keep track of everybody. Jessica, go ahead.
So I thought this was super fascinating, and I have like many notes and questions. So I'm going to try to not go into all of those. A few particular points. One, I don't know if this is outside of the scope, but I'd be super fascinated to hear your thoughts as to if you know or are familiar with the ANCSA settlement in 1971 in Alaska and the ways in which property rights there have really meant to be different than the formal reservation system on the mainland, but exhibit some of the problems that you're talking about as sort of limited, full, sort of, these private corporations, right, that limit, that are limited and must be, the shares must be given to native families, and so you can't sell them, which means you can't exhibit any sort of exit threat or anything like that. So I'd be super interested if that's a direction you're interested in going in. I had another question, though, about your methodology. At the bottom of page 9, you note that the census income, the primary measure of income, your dependent variable throughout, does not include goods produced and consumed on farm. And so this doesn't necessarily have to be a problem, but I'm trying to think about whether that makes me have some questions about your results, right? Because if high income, if sort of high soil quality is also consistent with your high income, and medium level soil income or soil and prime farmland is consistent with poor or with low incomes, are those also the areas where we would expect natives to be relying more on the land, and therefore income would be somewhat of a less appropriate measure for well-being? And this just gets to a question of, are there other measures of well-being or, for lack of a better word, human development kind of indicators that would help to validate or provide a check on the income measure, given that it doesn't include farm and sort of products consumed on farm, given that the goal is, the fundamental puzzle has to do with improved agricultural possibilities.
Yeah.
So I'll just leave it at that. I'm curious as to whether how you thought about that.
Thank you for the comments. I'd be interested to hear your others too, if you don't have time to provide them today. The Alaskan Native corporations, I think, are super interesting contrast, not just with the U.S. reservation system in terms of the institutional design, but also a contrast with what's done in Australia, what's done in New Zealand, what's done in Canada. So they really are different in that asset ownership isn't, it's like not linked to where you live in such a clear way as it is in Canada and the U.S. anyway. I am surprised that there's very little research, at least in economics, about the impacts of Alaskan Native corporate ownership of timber production and oil and gas and things. I have dabbled in starting a project to do some comparative analysis of that system with others, and always puttered out. Not because it didn't look feasible, but just because other things came up. So I would be very interested in looking at that. So maybe we should talk more about that. It's a good point about income. So what's the census said is not included is subsistence in the in-kind value of farm products that are consumed. So that is missing I was wondering how that would impact, it doesn't show up in the county level regression, so you get a very different relationship across counties that are in similar areas endowed with the same resources. So that's one point. But on your second point, I think we can and should look at other outcome measures that are going to be correlated with income. Income is correlated with a lot of things that you would expect it to be correlated with if it's a valid measure of standard of living. So it's correlated with indoor plumbing, high school education rates, health outcomes. So I think we could develop that more and probably should. It's a good point.
Yeah. Nick, not you, Nick, the other Nick.
I guess, Mike, I'm curious kind of about the failure of the privatization efforts, the kind of not full. How much of it is due to just the bad design of the way it's done versus, say, public choice issues where the incentives of the actors in implementing these things aren't lining up? I guess that was kind of the question that kind of kept popping to me when I was reading the paper was, which is this? Is this, just we don't have the knowledge necessary to effectively privatize? Or is it that, the incentives of the political actors in this are just going to be rent-seeking and taking advantage of the system, thus causing the bad?
It's a great question. So we talk a little bit about, but don't get into this in very much detail in the paper, about two big coalitions that lobbied for the Dawes Act. And there was the land grabbers, which white settlers who wanted access to land. And then there was the reformers, maybe that's not a good word, but I think that's what we call them, who wanted earnestly to help Native Americans succeed, and they thought this was the way to do it. And we had thought some about trying to identify what motivation was a driver here, and kind of conclude we can't say much about that because, on one hand,
maybe a little bit of both. Is this like
I think it's surely it's both. Yeah. Surely it's both. We thought, well, so here's some results that are consistent with either motivation. You get, better land, more rainfall, closer to a railroad, the land's more likely to be fully privatized. You say, aha, that's evidence that the grabbers are dominant here because the grabbers want valuable lands, can be close to railroads. But if you earnestly want Native Americans to succeed, you'd prioritize, especially if you think they're going to be commercial agriculturalists, you'd prioritize and put them close to a rail line because they could get inputs and get their product to market. So it's pretty hard. There's one thing we can do that we haven't done yet, is that the original act set aside surplus land. They allocate 160 acres, say, to every family. And then when that's left over, the remaining land is open for non-Indian settlement. And so one variable we have is basically the acreage divided by the 1885 population. And that is maybe a variable that its sign would tell us something about the motivation. In terms of sort of the actual execution of Dawes over time, I think some of these things, there's a 25-year waiting period initially that, if land was allotted, there had to be a 25 waiting period before it was freed from trust and could be alienated and privatized and sold. And one reason for that, at least in the stated records, is to protect Native Americans who otherwise might be swindled by savvy non-Indians in land markets. Later that was changed so that if an individual bureaucrat declared, you competent, then the land could be freed for trust. And so there could be some special interests that work there in that declaration of competency, and it might not have been, in the interest of, the Native American family and protecting them. So there's sort of a mix of trying, of using these constraints on full ownership as protections, And then different policies over time that suggest that maybe that was too much protection and there wasn't enough access to the resources. I don't know if that answered your question, but it's kind
It
of
gets at it.
yeah.
Why don't you just go ahead, Frederick? I'm behind you, so.
Yeah, no, I just had like a point on this exact issue, and I wanted to ask the same question about the sort of incentives that are regulating the passage of the Dawes Act to begin with, and to what extent those incentives are actually like stacked against the native amendments to begin with, right? And so I think that perhaps the paper can go a little bit more. You can do more in the paper to sort of like clear that like obvious questions. Like this doesn't seem to be an act that is meant to benefit the populations as much as perhaps like you would like it to be. I wonder if there's a way of solving this problem though by looking at the amendments. So, and I know nothing about the Dawes Act, but I was looking at it briefly, and it was amended 4 times in 20 years. What are these amendments, and where do they perhaps like this is these are amendments that are like that point towards like a greater like attempt to work towards the incentives of or the preferences of the native populations. Perhaps they're not, and so perhaps looking at the amendment might be a good way to sort of like clear the ground for that particular section.
That's a good suggestion. I know 2 amendments. One was a change from the 25-year waiting period to the declaration of competency. Another amendment, I believe, had to do with subsurface ownership rights. Is that going to be subdivided and given to the surface owners or not? On this point, Dean reminded me of this right before the talk. There's a scholar, Fred McChesney, he's a law professor at Northwestern and then at University of Miami, who died about 2 weeks ago, and he has a paper looking at we cited in our draft, but looking at political economy issues of the Dawes Act. And one constituency he points to that we, I guess, have said nothing about in the paper is the Department of Interior, Bureau of Indian Affairs agents themselves. And he argues that the way that the Allotment Act, the Dawes Act, was executed was in such a way to preserve some power of the Bureau, to make sure, if all the land gets privatized, you have no Bureau, is his argument. And so this kind of stopping and starting, amending, is consistent with a model that the Bureau is trying to survive and keep a high budget. And indeed today, the Bureau is often identified as an obstacle to some kind of reform because with this fractionated land interests and trusteeship, there's a lot of work for federal government agencies to kind of sift through records, and so that's another potential constituency. I think we can develop this. I think it's a good suggestion to dig into those.
So there's an empty queue, but I'm stuck myself in the middle of it. I wonder if you could think of a counterfactual here, Nick. Because if you push this, I think you get kind of a strange implication maybe. That is, let's suppose the Indian Reorganization Act never happened, that the Dawes Act was implemented as expected, and all this land becomes fully privatized. So the problem really is you get the stuff that's caught in this no man's land of private trust land, which you can't be taxed, it can't be used for collateral, and all of that stuff. What if it was just fully privatized? I mean, that's basically what happened to the Oklahoma Indians, who are actually quite wealthy. I mean, and off-reservation Indians are actually not near as poor as on-reservation Indians. I don't think that comes out. I mean, you get the sense reading it that it was designed to doom everybody, but a lot of people have left and sort of joined the larger system, so to speak. A lot of those, so your Fort Berthold picture, a lot of those guys are Indian farmers on their private land, even though they're within the border of the reservation. And I don't know that you were able to sort out how those guys are doing. We kind of know from other studies and talking to people, they're doing just as well as white farmers on private lands in the area who may have got the land through the allotment process themselves. So you might be able to, with your data, tell us what a fully privatized reservation would look like and what the incomes would look like. It'd be kind of interesting to see.
Yeah, we don't do that very clearly at all. But this is our We certainly and this is something I was working on last night to try to clarify actually. Here's what the model implies, and I mean there's a lot of noise and so there's high standard errors, and you can worry about various things about the empirics. But we estimate if you were allotted and fully privatized, this is in a world where reservation boundaries are maintained and you still, so Oklahoma is actually excluded from this. So this is maybe an underestimate because the federal government doesn't consider Oklahoma reservations as federally recognized. So this is perhaps an underestimate because of that. But this is a 12% increase in income per capita of Native Americans. We're not including non-Indians in the calculation, but a decrease in Native American populations, and this is relative to historical benchmarks of income and population. So what we think that means is you would get what you have in Oklahoma, which is more income per person, but whites interspersed on the reservation. And at least some advocates of the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934 thought one of the big problems they were solving was Indian land loss and the interspersion of whites on reservations, which was destroying cultures. So this is kind of saying, it depends on what outcome you want to judge Dawes on, but if you want to judge it on income per capita of the people that are there, then full privatization is good. If you want to judge it on how much land is held by non-Indians, then maybe it's not good.
We have an open queue then.
But Dean's point, another thing I think Dean raises here is, we can't track what happened to Native Americans that got title to land, sold it, and moved somewhere else. I mean, this is all, our unit of observation is a reservation, and so we're measuring what's happening on reservations. We don't know if you sold your land in 1914, moved to Minneapolis, we can't follow you. Thank you.
Yeah, now they're just open
This is a
queue.
minor point, but
Yeah, okay.
why look at per capita income,
Instead of total income?
household income, or
Yeah.
I started thinking about interaction effects, and maybe
Yeah.
something else is going on as well.
Yeah.
And
Well, so we built this long panel, which is from spending a bunch of time at the National Archives. So the old income data that we have is pretty limited. So you can calculate per capita income and not much else. But starting in the 1970 census, which is mainly what we rely on, we could look at like median family income, for example, and some of these other outcomes Jessica was looking for.
So I
We
guess
can look
what I
at
was thinking is,
median instead of per
what if
capita.
there are other policies that are inducing some of these households to be larger because of subsidies and just things like that?
Yeah. We could look at total income. We could look at median family income. Right. Yeah, you endogenize population size, basically.
Gustavo.
So it's I was also thinking in potential contrafactuals, and I had in mind what about checking for some shocks that would affect this land, like I don't know, other potential uses of land, like minerals or oil, and how they are affected when they receive a more or less similar shock. If I discover oil in this piece of land versus this piece of land, how the income per capita react.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And that's another way of estimating
Yeah.
the same things that you are estimating, but through a different, I don't know.
So if you could find two, let me just make sure I'm understanding you right. So if you find two places that both have wheat,
Yeah,
but they have different land tenure arrangements, and the price of wheat goes up,
yeah.
that's
For
your shock, and then see how that's a good
example.
idea. Yeah.
Yeah, or
So-
even non-agricultural uses. It's
Yeah.
called oil. Or,
Yeah.
that's one thing, and then the second one is like maybe I think it's good to be a little bit more precise in the discussion of exactly what you can do in this with this weird tenure thing. It's like you can sell. I understood that you can sell to other Native Americans, but you cannot sell to people that are outside the reservation. So to be a little bit more precise, exactly what things you're allowed to do. Well, in terms of collateral, in terms of long-term contract, blah blah. So essentially, so I was trying to get a feeling of how restrictive was the. Because I think, and you have like a comparative perspective there. It's, I think that in China you also have some part of the agricultural land, or even urban land that is allocated with this system, but it looked like it's less restrictive, but I don't know why, so maybe it's also interesting to figure out exactly why it's more or less restrictive.
Yeah, that's a good point. Two things to describe in with more precision what the restrictions actually are, and maybe compare those restrictions to other places. That would be a way to broaden the literature connections. One thing Dean pointed out is that one big thing is there's a constraint on transferability. So non-members of the tribe can't easily acquire the land. I'll just say it that way, and that means that's directly related to your ability to use the land as collateral and a loan, because most creditors are going to be non-Indians, non-tribal members. So a big problem in the developing world in general and on reservations is limited access to credit, and this certainly exacerbates that.
It's a follow-up question. It's like, the other thing I was trying to understand is why you get this fragmentation, because it's like you can still sell the land within the community. No, why not one guy from the community buy the rest? And essentially, once you have one family, this looks more like private property, no? So why they end up with this, 100 owners?
Yeah, so this is a graph of fractionation and undivided interests, and kind of just shows you that the problem blows up with each generation. The basic thing is that you can't will to an individual heir your right. So that's the main thing. So, your heirs can get together after being willed the land, but you already have the large N problem by that time, because if you have, 12 heirs or 8 heirs or whatever, that you can't pick as, that this is going to this person, all 8 of them get it, and then they need to coordinate with each other if they want to consolidate ownership.
Maybe you can exploit the size of the families to figure out how important was this particular institution.
That's a good point, and I think we do have. I think that old. That's related to Jim's point. Yeah. I think we can do that for some of these old. Actually, we might be able to do it for the really old data sets. I guess you'd have to assume that preferences towards family size is somehow sticky for this problem, but then endogenous for your problem.
But let's say the first generation. Yeah. So it's like how many kids the family had in the first generation. That's going to be, I think that will give you the highest variation, no? Because then everything will kind of scale up.
Would you want to know more about how that policy came to be? Because if the families are actually aware of that policy,
yeah,
right? I would actually expect their decisions to be significantly influenced by.
But I would say that if you go to the past, it's like maybe fertility was not. They were not so able to control.
I think we look at family size like early years before anyone would anticipate a trustee policy that would freeze heirship ownership.
Yeah, Jessica.
I just had a follow on to some of these points. One of the things that would be sort of helpful, you have a lot of different empirics in this paper.
Yeah.
some of which I was interested in sort of some of the decisions that you made to not do any sort of interactions or two-stage kinds of things. I can ask you about that later. One question I had though is, do you have like any sort of case comparisons to sort of maybe elucidate some of these transaction costs that you were talking about? How do they actually play out? Like, how do these actors make decisions that play out one way under these constrained contexts in which transaction costs are high versus others? So if you even have like, you have that one data set that's beautiful, like hundreds of thousands of parcel year data sets. Is there any way you can either drill into that just to tell a little bit more of a story so we can understand a little bit more of the causal process that is underpinning all of the awesome empirics in that? I don't know if that's available to you, even on the more recent side, if you could do a plausibility check for how people are making decisions about investment given these constraints would be really helpful.
Yeah. So there's a lot of law review articles that dig into some of this stuff. And you know, so there's sort of cherry-picked examples there. There's a law professor who's done great work on this, Jessica Shoemaker. She's at University of Nebraska. I was just talking to her about this last week. She's got a bunch of little stories about, you know, oil and gas company comes to try to make an agreement with Native Americans, and you got this fractionation problem, and just lots of stories of them just giving up because it's too big of a hassle. But I'm sure we could dig up more case study stuff. Yeah. Sorry, I mean,
I don't mean to like add.
Let me-
I'm just curious if there's a way to.
Let me jump back in here. So one of the things I find limiting, and maybe it goes to Jimmy's point of using per capita income as the you know, the outcome variable, and then what's driving it is the land tenure. I mean, the mechanism there, if we're all farmers, we're all deriving all of our income from land, then it makes good sense, but we're not. If you've been to a real reservation, you know there's a lot of people who aren't farming, maybe not doing a lot of anything, and they're part of the data set. So back in the day with the small data set that Anderson and I looked at, we just looked at the value of ag output, which is directly linked to the land tenure given investment incentives, collateralization, and all this stuff. So you know, it'd be interesting to have you think through more what is the mechanism of land tenure in terms of driving per capita income on the larger reservation where the bulk of the people are not farmers. They're working for the BIA, they're working in the town or whatever, or they're not working, whatever it is. That I think is a limiting feature of this design. Maybe I'm just curious to what your reaction to that.
Yeah, I think we can cobble together, this is in the spirit of Jessica's comment, we can cobble together stories of how land tenure is influencing how productive a particular resource use is, and also the choice to engage in that resource use. I mean, I think I like your point. I think it's true. I think one advantage of income is it allows decisions basically to be endogenous. So, you know, if you have a land tenure problem that isn't conducive to agricultural productivity, like communal ownership on tribal land, then you probably reinvest your resources into something else. So making a comparison about, you know, is resource use A more or less productive on these two different kinds of reservations, I think is informative, but I also think it needs to be complemented with looking at income, because income sort of like, you know, optimization subject to the constraints that you face, so you don't engage in farming if you have this problem, but there might be something else you can summon up income from.
But the issue is why you don't leave that. Okay, so you got people who are sticking around, not farming and not really doing much of anything, and income's low. And Now, is it because of the land tenure?
Yeah.
And how does that, I mean, that's the thing, I'm just
Well,
not
they-
sure how it works.
well,
I know
they-
how it works on the farm income.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, they do leave. I mean, we find that fractionation is associated with
Sure.
fewer people, so they do leave, but not everyone leaves. So why are some people there, and what are they doing? I mean,
Yeah.
we could learn more about that. Yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah, Bob.
On that point, is it like a collective action problem? In other words, the land is, ownership is so dispersed among so many people. There's maybe a significant minority that like to farm it, and others that just really don't care much. So they're hanging around, and maybe they're, as a matter of custom or sort of just familial loyalty, benefiting from some of the income generated on the land, but they're really not doing much. They're just hanging out.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Yeah.
How do you compel them to, put their shoulder up against the plow,
Yeah.
so to speak?
I mean, there's unemployment rates are very high on reservations, so there's people who are not laborers. Self-employment rates are also low, so there's not a lot of self-employed people. Some people who own a fractionized interest are gone, and they earn a little check every month for like $4.32 or something. Some people stay on the reservation, but it's arguments go in both directions, but it's not obvious there's a lot of like pecuniary benefits from just being on the reservation. If your reservation has a casino and you're clearly a member and that's not under dispute, you can get your payment if they do give per capita payments regardless of where you live. So I think there's a lot of I guess I'll say I don't know why. I don't know I don't have a model of people's choice of
And there may be
to
some
stay or
areas
go,
that-
but in terms of these really reduced form relationships, I mean, these policies are affecting. They seem to be strongly affecting the size of Native American populations relative to the size of the population before the policy was implemented. In a way, like this fractionation thing, I mean, it's negatively associated with per capita income, and it's negatively associated with the number of Native Americans on the reservation, so then it's negatively associated with total income. It seems like a losing policy any way you cut it.
So we have Federica, then Jimmy.
I really want to ask this question, but I don't know how, because I don't think that it actually matters. But
Let me ask it for you.
I'm just gonna wear the humanist hat for a second and then just leave. So what if this has nothing to do with land quality and productivity in terms of agriculture? Like, it seems to me that there's a story that may or may not matter. Probably doesn't matter. But there's a story of like value of land for an Indian reservation that has nothing to do with the degree to which you make that land productive for agricultural purposes. Having said that, I think that's a question that needs to be asked, but I'm not sure where to really plug it within in the economy of your paper. So I'm just going to leave it at that.
Yeah. It's proved very difficult to fix this problem. And it's interesting because the cost of fractionation are growing over time, so the benefits of solving the problem are growing over time, but the transaction costs of doing it are also, so both the benefits of solving the problem are getting bigger over time, but so are the costs. It's proved very difficult. There's been some attempts here or there, and most of them have failed. And so there does appear to be, I mean, you could argue, there may be a constituency that wants to keep this regime, and it might be some Native Americans that don't want to give up, their piece of the piece of the ancestry land. It's hard to know how much of the opposition to consolidation is because of that or more strategic interest that you're holding out to get a better deal.
Let me add to that. So I'm not sure I'm buying what you're saying here. So several tribes now have implemented programs to consolidate the airship lands and put them back into tribal hands, which is So there's some constituency for expanding the tribal domain rather than this fractionated private land. So that's happening, and I don't, so it sort of gets at what you're talking about. And I just thought I would point that out. I mean, I'm not. There are a number of tribes. In fact, I think at this website you can learn.
There's a class action litigation, a Cobell Settlement, where a group of individual owners of allotted trust land sued the federal government, litigated for many years, and part of the settlement was per capita payments to trustee owners. And the basis for the suit was that the federal government grossly mismanaged these assets. And so there was a settlement. So the two parts of the settlement, payments to individuals, but also a pool of money, $2 billion to try to consolidate land interests. So the money that's being used to do what Dean's talking about is mostly coming from this class action suit. And so in some places land is getting bought and get consolidated with the tribal government. But I just went to a presentation about this, and what the presentation demonstrated is like the fractionation problem looks like this. Over time, the number of owners, and it's going like this, and then you have this Cobell Settlement, and it's going to do this, and then go back up. So the argument in this presentation is this is just like the problem's blowing up so fast that $2 billion is going to get you almost nowhere.
Yeah, my point was simply that there is a demand to expand tribal lands, which is Federica, that there's a demand among certain, non-trivial amount of natives to have a larger tribal land base. I mean, that's really, and I don't know what you do with, and that suggests a different kind of demand, different kind of value toward the land, which is aesthetic value, whatever you want to think of it as. That's so there's some evidence there's that, and there's other buy-up programs too.
There's demand for it and there's opposition to it because
Sure.
some places members say they don't want their government to own the land, and so so it's happening.
Right, but I guess that the basic point is the point that was already brought out, which is a collective action problem, right? There seems to be something going on within the reservation that just doesn't make it so simple that if you have good land, you're going to use that land and you're going to draw income from it, and the land tenure is the only thing that's going to prevent that. And there seems to be like competing demands on the value of land that make productive use in terms of agricultural output not the only game.
But wouldn't it have to track with the value of the land then, in order to get the results that he's getting?
That was going to be my good. Thank you. Yeah. I can say that those, the potential benefit of consolidation or fixing this problem is going to be positively related to the quality of the land.
Right.
So if the land is not worth anything, it's more likely I would predict it's more likely to linger in fractionated status, which is more or less what we found.
But, yeah. Jimmy, and then Gustavo.
Yeah,
Jimmy, you were on the queue.
So mine, I think it actually is more of a clarification. So you're getting counties outside the reservation, land quality, income goes up, right? Reservations, it's like this.
Yes.
So maybe it would help, and for those of us that aren't really studying this area, you might, as you write your paper, you might think about the reader who's not picking up on the details. Because I think your story is about when they decided on how this land was going to be distributed in the property rights, whether it was really poor land or sort of medium land or high quality land affected the rules that were used.
Yes.
Which explains this.
That's our
I mean, that's a
story,
different
yeah.
story. Then you could also imagine that sort of these property right issues cause higher transaction costs. So what if your data had looked like this is the counties without a reservation, and this is farmland with reservations. So I guess I'm getting to is, could one argue that you're getting this result because there's a lot of noise in whatever's going on until you finally get to really high quality land so that overrides these property right issues? Or is it more about simply the way they set up these property rights to begin with that created this problem? They might be related, but you see where we're going here?
I don't completely follow.
I'm not sure I do either. So the counterfactual is, just imagine the way they set up these property rights. It just took away this ability to put highly productive land into good use. Then you might get no effect of land quality, right? Right. But you're getting something that looks like this. Well, maybe the economics are, if it's important enough, we'll find a way. But on this other end, it's just not important enough. But then there's another thing, that the rules they use literally created different incentives on this end than they did on this end. That's what I'm saying. And I think you're saying the rules they put in use created different incentives here, or different property rights here than on this end.
That is our claim. Yeah.
That
is our claim. Yeah.
So is there any evidence
we
that...
think, I mean, I guess, you know, this is, you could add more structure to this kind of theorizing, but it would seem, at least at first blush, that if systems of property rights were homogeneous across land quality, basically the county situation,
Right.
then all else equal, you'd expect a, you know, positive relationship.
Right.
And so, yeah, our claim is that the property institutions are not conducive to economic activity in this area that explains our downward
Until
slope.
the... Yeah, but then you do have this, the tail end here, the last half, you've got this relationship, right?
The high quality?
Yeah. You get the same relationship you get in the counties, right?
That's right. Yeah, no, in fact, actually, when we control in a regression for these features of land tenure, we get this on reservations.
Right.
So
Okay,
condition,
that's right. That's all I'm saying
yeah,
is, that's the point that really,
isn't clear.
I'm not saying it's not clear, just for those of us that are
Yeah.
not reading this in depth.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
know
yeah,
this
yeah,
area,
yeah.
might not pick up
Yeah.
on it or go away with it.
Yeah, I mean, actually, our setup is similar to Nathan Nunn and Diego Puga have a paper about it's about ruggedness in Africa. Look at African states, and the puzzle we set it up similar to how they've set theirs up. Their puzzle is that states in Africa with rugged land are paradoxically like doing better in terms of income generation than states in Africa with tillable good land. And they say, why is that? And then they go on to say, well, it's because if you had rugged land, you were protected from the slave trade. And once you control for slave trade activity, rugged land is actually bad for economic growth. So we're kind of doing the same thing. We say this is, you know, property rights are basically already controlled for here. They're homogeneous. Once you control for them here, your outcome looks more like this. But we don't make that very clear.
That's what I was saying, it's more of a clarification
Okay.
question.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Julio
Sorry,
and
it took
Michael.
so long.
See, we got Gustavo, Julio, and Michael. So.
Yeah, but just
Oh,
on
go
this
ahead.
point about what you were saying, that if people in this area, that the claim might not be completely clear. I think that the claim is pretty. I think that the hypothesis is pretty clear. If I'm thinking of the Mexican case with the Hilo setting, the case where property rights are actually going to determine the economic outcomes, in this case, is going to be pretty clear. I mean, in the Mexican case, there is evidence that the constraints in the property rights had affected migration, had affected voting, had affected a lot of things. And it's not quite the same case because in the Mexican setting, people actually chose the property rights scheme. But in this case, the property rights scheme were given to the Native American, let's say, somehow. So for me, it's pretty clear the implications. So property rights are going to matter in this case, and property rights are going to matter in the middle, like you say, because Native Americans with mediocre land are going to be safe from actually having the property rights fraction, and they are going to be able to actually, or well, the other way around. So people in the middle are going to have their property rights affected, and they are going to be less productive, they are going to be able to derive less income, they might be able to be less able to migrate. So there are many causal mechanisms that could explain this, but the relationship for me, at least thinking of the Mexican case, is quite clear. So I think it's actually something.
But maybe we can talk later about, you can
Yeah, there's
point
a
me
lot
to
of
some
yeah.
literature that we can
Yeah,
connect
can be
to.
related to
Yeah,
that.
thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Ultimately, you make these least efficiency of these middle quality plots due to the dispersed land holdings or dispersed land tenure structures. But at the end, I was assuming that you have on the other side these better quality soils. They get allocated according to market principles, more like. So at the end, you have top-down allocation principle against the market principle, which every economist would expect that the market principle performs better. So that would be not surprising to find that, but you don't discuss it, it seems to me.
To emphasize to a greater degree how a market selection process should outperform a bureaucratic top-down process.
It seems that this is what you found.
Yeah. No, this sheds a reasonably a positive light on local governance, really tribal. At least tribes that were left the flexibility to devise property rights systems seem to have done pretty well relative to the top down. So, what am I trying to say? It's not surprising to us that the market outcome does better than the top down. That's not very surprising. What I think is more interesting and provocative and more surprising is that the tribal governance does better than top down.
But this is probably because of the allotment creates inefficiencies, so you allot plots that are suitable for maize farming to potato farms or something like that. So it's allocational inefficiencies from the top down regarding the local governance structures and regarding the...
Yeah, definitely difficulty.
And not so much a transaction cost due to dispersed land holdings.
I think... Okay, I think you can't anticipate in 1907 what the optimal size of the farm is going to be in 1980 or 1990, and if you put it in this trust status, it's been very difficult to. Dean points to some successes, but in general, it's been really difficult to consolidate land holdings to adjust to what might become a different optimal scale over time and things like this. So I think at the time these parcels were allocated, there were 160 acres, and that was fine for farming circa 1907, but over time it became less optimal. And they weren't, the transaction costs were really high of consolidating up.
Gustavo.
So, so it seems that part of the story of why they get this type of property rights structure is essentially that they fear that they could be expropriated with standard property rights, no?
Yeah.
Private property rights.
That's
well,
what.
Do we have any evidence of that when private property right was chosen, essentially? Because that could be something interesting. Also,
I'll show you. I like this poster. There's a sign for Indian land for sale. I think this is from early 1900s. Can't remember when, but we don't have systematic evidence, but there's a lot of stories in books that have been written about this of individual, families who were not expropriated but swindled.
Follow up.
Is that not what you're asking them?
Yeah, I'm proposing.
Well, you don't know if
part
they're
of the level
swindled
of
here.
calculation.
That's the claim, and the claims in lots of stories are here's an example of this person. Yeah, I don't know if you like the word swindled, but there's information asymmetries, and some of these policies were allegedly trying to protect individual Native Americans from being swindled.
I was thinking something like
Okay,
very
something
back
like
of the envelope calculation. It's like what has to be the probability of expropriation, so you end up better off with these crappy property institutions than with private property rights.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
So essentially, like doing a reverse engineering in that sense. So if you are getting an expropriation rate that is all, you have to be expropriated with probability of 90%, I would say, well, but if, with 10% or 15%, that's kind of...
Yeah, you'd be better off with your postage stamp than a 0.95 probability of 0. Yeah. Thank you.
I think we're done, Bob. And,
Over lunch.
and you're going to lunch anyway. So thank Nick. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.